When external shocks have jolted the provincial economy, governments have stepped up and spent to support hard-hit businesses and workers. Think of the 2008 financial crisis or the COVID-19 pandemic. But with public debt now north of $400 billion and fears of what it'll cost to backstop Donald Trump's tariff threats, does the province have the balance sheet strength to protect us from the worst? Let's explore that with, in Scottsdale, Arizona, Don Drummond, adjunct professor and Stauffer Dunning Fellow at the School of Public Policy Studies at Queen's University. He also chaired a major attempt in 2012 to get the province's books in order. And with us here in studio, Kaylee Thiessen, economist and policy analyst at Unifor, and Daniel Tisch, president and CEO of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. And we always got to do this full disclosure thing. We should point out that Kaylee is with Unifor. The people taking our pictures are from Unifor.
Oh, yeah.
So I could make a funny comment about, we know you'll be in focus. I don't know about the rest of us. But anyway, no, we put that on the record for whatever reason.
Absolutely.
Anyways, let's, Sheldon, bring the chart up if you would right now. This is a chart showing the province's debt to GDP ratio. It's basically a way of measuring how big the money we owe is relative to the size of the economy. Obviously, lower is better. The charts, for those listening on podcast, I'll just describe what we're looking at. It starts in 1990 and it goes to last year. And we have gone from 13.4% then to 37.3% now. It's actually higher a few years ago, but it has come down a little bit. So that was the state of the books once upon a time. That is the state of the situation right now. And Don, I want to bring you in because Premier Dalton McGuinty, about 13 years ago, brought you in to take a look at the province's books and see if you could get a handle on spending and debt reduction, that kind of thing. Compare, if you would, the state of the province's books then, when you were brought in, to the state of the books today.
Well, they're worse now. So that chart is the very thing that I obsessed with over 2012, and I called it the staircase, because as you think about that visual image that we just saw, every time there's a shock like the 1990 recession, the 2008 financial crisis, that debt to GDP ratio soared up. In theory, as the economy recovers, it's supposed to come back down again, but it never did. It went to a higher level. It stayed at that higher level. Then you got another shock and it went higher still. And of course, post 2012, we had the pandemic. And as you saw from that chart, that debt ratio went up again. It's come down a little bit, but never mind not coming back to the 13% you referenced as the starting point. It's not even come back to anything close we had in the financial crisis or when I did it. So the deficits, yeah, the deficits are a concern, but that's not the biggest concern on the fiscal side. The biggest one's on the debt. And then just finally, what the other thing I was focused on when I did the commission, what is all that money getting us? And that's probably arguably even worse. We've got a mediocre K-12 education system by international standards. Our post-secondary education institutions are on the verge of bankruptcy. They're just been hammered by everything conceivable. We're not a competitive economy. We have this huge productivity gap with the U.S., and that's getting worse. So we're spending a lot of money. We're in debt, but we don't have very much to show for it.
We will come back to that, what we have to show for the investments that we made. Kaylee, if we owe north of $400 billion, $400 billion, characterize that if you would. Is that traumatic? Is that manageable? What is it?
It completely depends on the size of the economy. So we're like, the number we care about is the 37.3, not necessarily the 400 billion. We need to compare that to the size of the economy. But the other thing I think to think about right now is that it's not time to fuss about this number that is most certainly going to get bigger no matter what we do in Ontario in the face of what's happening south of the border. We're being put in a existential crisis because of Trump. And what I would like our politicians to be talking about, what I would like us all to be talking about, is what we're going to do in order to make sure that we build the economy and the province that we want to have, and then talk about how to deal with the debt after. Because right now, we need to make sure that we're taking care of the people who are going to be hit the worst by this crisis and make sure we don't leave them out to dry.
Well, fair enough, and we will come back to that. But again, I'm trying to get a sense about whether, well, for example, the province says as long as we keep our debt to GDP ratio below 40%, that's for some reason a magic number, we're doing okay. Agree or disagree?
Well, I guess it depends what we consider okay, and it also depends on what are we doing. I think Don's question, I think, was I think a very smart one, right? Like, how are we spending that money, right? So, and I guess what we would say at the Ontario Chamber is, if we're making investments in the productive capacity of the economy or in the capabilities of people in the economy, those are good investments. If we're just subsidizing consumption, those aren't so good investments.
So then let's do the follow-up question. Are we or are we not?
Well, we're doing both, right? I mean, if you look at it, the government's put, I think close to $200 billion over 10 years. It's committed to big investments in some things that are really important.
Subways,
right?
highways.
Yeah, so transit or broadband or primary care reform, enabling more people to connect to doctors, even though it's not enough. So these are examples of smart spending, but at the same time, we've got $3 billion being spent on giving us all $200 checks.
Not all of us, only those of us who filed tax returns,
well, okay.
which means the people who need it most aren't getting it.
Absolutely right, right? So you've got to wonder, how effective is that? We're talking about taking tolls. You have the politicians now competing with each other to see who can be faster to reduce tolls on the highways. We're hearing about buying back the 407, which would cost $30 billion or more without adding any new capacity to the provincial highway system. So to us, these are all examples of poor spending choices, understandable when there's an affordability crisis, but ultimately you've got to get at the root causes that make life unaffordable for people.
Don Drummond, can I get you to weigh in on the issue of the money we're spending and whether it is being wisely invested as opposed to just fueling consumer choices?
Just first, I heartily disagree with the notion that keeping the debt ratio under 40% is safe. We're spending almost 10 cents of the revenue dollar in interest on public debt. So that's money that's not available for health or education or supporting the social needs of the people of Ontario. The debt ratio should be much lower than that. I think 20% would be the highest that you would want to see on that front. Well, we could add a lot of lists to that. We've got these reductions in the gasoline excise tax. That's not a good use of the public money. That's a perfectly reasonable way to pay for the services that the people of Ontario want and need. We've spent this fortune just to get alcohol in corner stores a little bit earlier. I mean, maybe that's a desirable thing to do, but what was the need to rush with that and to waste the money on that? So I don't think the money's been wisely spent. I agree that if we have this economic damage, which seems to be coming our way, all we can do is, we told you not to do this and you did it. You left us vulnerable, but that's not the time to do it. But on the other hand, the shovels are still out, making the hole digger. And there are needs that we have and ways that the money could be better spent. And we're just seeing it being wasted as far as I'm concerned.
Can I add a few pieces of waste to that list? I think about private equity in healthcare and how we need to be spending on healthcare. We've been spending a little bit more on healthcare than we have in the past, but we've also seen a lot of that money go to private delivery. So we still have a single payer system. It's free to me. Sometimes there's a little bit of an extra charge. But private equity is siphoning massive profits. And the more we allow private equity into that system, the less service we get for the money that we are paying. And so we could put some rules in place to limit that. And I think that would go a long way, not necessarily to a decreased spending, but at least to improve the quality of that service. In public transit, when you look at the infrastructure that's being built, think about the Eglinton Crosstown if you're in Toronto and how far over the time limit that is and over budget. Perhaps if we were worried less about making sure that private sector was making as big of a profit as possible, and instead we're focused on building the transit that we need with a reasonable contract and one that holds private sector accountable to the deadlines, then we'd have that transit that we need and we could be developing more instead of paying this.
Dan, you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I think in the end, we have to look at the outcomes that are achieved, right? Regardless of who's delivering the service, in the end, you've got to look at what kind of outcomes and are you creating innovation? Are you creating value? And of course, there has to be some accountability, whatever happens. But look, I certainly agree that there's an urgent need to invest in healthcare. There's an urgent, and even the investment the government has just announced, which I think is incredibly positive, it still falls far short of what the Ontario Medical Association says we need in terms of the number of Ontarians who are going to be without a doctor. One of the ones that we talk the most about is post-secondary education, right? I mean, Ontario still has the lowest per capita funding of, per student funding in post-secondary education, and really we should aspire to have the best.
Well,
right?
it's been that way for 50 years.
It's been that way a long time.
Yeah.
But look, I mean, we have to think differently, because the reality right now is that our greatest competitive advantages and the reasons people want to come here is because of the quality of education, the quality of people in our workforce, the quality of healthcare. Like, these are things which make us attractive relative to other jurisdictions. So how are we going to attract the best talent in the world, the best researchers, the best academics, the best teachers, the best students to do innovative work if our post-secondary education system is crumbling? So that's a key priority, for us, because our chambers, we have 150 chambers across Ontario, and every single one of them has a partnership, virtually every single one of them has a partnership with their local post-secondary institution, right? Because that's where the talent comes from, and we want to keep that talent in Ontario cities and towns.
Don, let me get your view on, let me put it this way. Some governments are very focused on reducing the deficit, paying down debt, others not so much. What have we got right now in Ontario?
A lack of concern about it. We had that temporary concern under Dalton McGuinty in my report, and for a few months it looked like they were going to follow that, and of course he got in trouble in natural gas plants, et cetera, et cetera. A new government wasn't very interested in it. We had at the federal level, Trudeau government came in promising to balance the budget in short order. They quickly lost interest in that, almost got drunk with the spending power given to them under the pandemic. And of course, that debt-to-GDP ratio soared up. So in the United States, we don't talk about it. They don't even talk about it. It was almost a non-election issue. They've got a massive debt, way worse problem than us. So it comes and goes in flavor. It's not in the flavor right now really to do anything about it. But then you get the crisis comes along and you realize you've been left totally unprepared for it. That's why you want to deal with it when times are reasonably good, and nobody wants to.
You made dozens and dozens of recommendations initially to the McGuinty government, but of course any government thereafter could have picked that shovel up and continued to fill in the hole as opposed to keep digging. What percentage of the recommendations were fulfilled, do you think?
Probably no more than half. And the more difficult ones were, and some partially. So we talked about health, and the easier thing is just to spend more money. But one of our big recommendations was scope of practice.
Right.
Doctors don't have to do everything. Nurse practitioners can do a lot of that. Registered nurse can do some, and nurse practitioners and down the line. And we do have these health teams now, but more on paper than in practice. And there's all kinds of restrictions on their ability to practice. We've got roughly 30 nurse practitioner-led clinics in Ontario. They have very high customer satisfaction ratings. They seem to be working well. They actually don't even do many referrals to physicians. We could have a lot more of that. We saw a movement of this in Nova Scotia, where that government promised to have more people register for care, and they opened up the nurse practitioner offices and pharmacies. So there's things that you can do that don't necessarily cost money. They're disruptive, they're a bit controversial, and they're a bit more difficult. It seems to be easier to do these little giveaways and spend more money than to do the hard work.
Yeah.
Kaylee, I'm just going to say, Kaylee, how concerned are you that the state of our books today are such that if we get a massive threat from Trump because of tariffs or whatever, we're not going to have the fiscal capability to respond appropriately?
I think we have the capability to respond appropriately, but I think that there will be folks who ask us to use the debt to GDP ratio as an excuse to not do it. And in the face of a threat like this, we saw during the pandemic government come through and actually provide support so that we had a very short, it was deep, we had a deep recession, but it was short. And if they had not done that, we could have ended up with quite a long recession, even a depression. In the after the financial crisis, it took a very long time to recover from that incident, whether you're looking at number of jobs, the wages and working conditions, those things catching up. You could argue that happened around 2015, and some would say that it didn't happen at all before we had the next crisis. So let's make sure we're building the supports that we need in order to keep that damage as low and short as possible, and then talk about all of these things that we've been mentioning today that are much more difficult to do than sending a $200 check to folks, but actually make a bigger difference in the long run.
What's your view, Dan, on whether or not the state of the books today is such that we have the room, the fiscal room, to help people if need be?
Well, we have room, but we don't have much room, right? And I think that's why the spending has to be very smart, right? And I don't think, it can be. We can't afford for it to be pandemic style, cash for everybody. I think it's got to be very focused, very targeted. And once again, we'd look at opportunities to actually, protect jobs, to help businesses become more innovative, more productive, to diversify their export markets, for example, to make critical investments, which now, because of the very threat of tariffs, are being deferred or denied entirely, right? And so I think we're going to have a lot of things to do. And I agree with Don, some of them don't cost a lot of money. In fact, they might actually make money.
Like what?
Internal trade, interprovincial trade barriers. You talked about that, I think, on a recent show.
We did last week, yeah.
I really enjoyed. And I think the panelists there made some amazing points just about how we can do this. And so what we've done is we've co-signed a letter where all the chambers in Canada, all the provincial chambers, have unanimously called on their premiers to work together to bring down these barriers. This is not new, but there's a new urgency around the conversation and a window of opportunity because they're actually agreeing, okay, we've got to get rid of these internal barriers which amount to, by some estimates, the equivalent of a 21% tariff, right, on trade within the country. So what does that do? It means lower prices and more choice for consumers. It means new opportunities for businesses to, market their services and sell their products across the country. It means workers, like healthcare workers, for instance, being able to go anywhere in the country where there's demand. And for government, it means, I think the estimate is $15 billion across the country in new tax revenue, which can be used to support the very things that Kaylee was talking about. So as well as support businesses in making the transition to diversify their trade. And so there's a lot of opportunity if we just are thoughtful about seizing them.
Don, can I get you to weigh in on that?
Well, absolutely. If we get a big economic shock, we're going to have to help people as we did in the pandemic. Hopefully it got to be more targeted, shorter duration than the previous time. But at the same time, we have to move with speed to improve the competitiveness of the economy. And this is where I'm just absolutely flabbergasted and almost the glee of attacking the post-secondary education system. It has to be one of the points of strength in the province, not just in terms of producing the type of graduates that employers need, but also in research. We double the percentage of research in Canada is driven by universities than in other countries. And that speaks to the weakness of our business investment, but also the strength. And yet they've been given this triple blow. So we've got a cut in the government funding. We had a freeze on the student tuitions. That's not doing the students any favor if they're going to get a poor education. And then, of course, they went on the revenue flow from foreign students, and now that's being cut back. And so they're in deep trouble. And I don't know why do you take something that is an asset, has been an asset, has to be an asset going forward, and put it in such jeopardy and almost seem to be gleeful about it.
Do you have a sense, Kaylee, about how much, let's assume that we see steel is going to be tariffed now, right? Trump has made this announcement. Do you have a sense about how much money the government of Ontario should, in some, this is not the right financial term, but should set aside, should allocate to spending to protect people from the worst ravages of whatever is coming?
I think we don't have a sense of how much this is going to cost. We don't have a sense of what is going to be tariffed and what's not, what tariffs that we will put on in exchange. What I'd rather see, instead of talk about a number, is talking about the system that should already have been in place. We learned so many lessons from the pandemic, or we could have learned so many lessons from the pandemic that we didn't, and we didn't put those sort of automatic stabilizers in place that we could, like stronger employment insurance, some sort of support for small and medium-sized businesses that really got hammered during the pandemic and get hammered during crises all the time in a way that larger businesses don't. If we had those plans in place now, we wouldn't be arguing about it. We would say, look, we have a plan and we're going to make sure that you're protected, and here's what we can focus on to make sure that the pain is as limited as possible.
Can I understand how that would work, though? Would you want employers and employees to raise the amount they contribute to the EI system so they could take more out when needed?
We would like to see a system that delivers, right now 40% of unemployed people actually qualify for unemployment insurance, even though we all pay into it. So we'd like to see a system, perhaps it means paying a little bit more, perhaps it means the federal government puts more money in again like it used to and kind of stopped. We want to see the rate of return, that's not the right term, but the income replacement rate should be increased, and we should make sure that people who are working, people who pay into the system, actually get the benefit and the insurance that they're paying for.
Dan, can you sign on to that?
Well, I think it's worth looking at all of this, right? I mean, it's worth looking at systemic reforms that can make our businesses, particularly small businesses, more productive and our economy more competitive. And so, if you look at the questions I think we need to be asking politicians as they, vie for our support in this election is, okay, what are you going to do to ensure we have, particularly for small business, but for all business, a more competitive business environment, right? What are you going to do in terms of the future of the infrastructure that we need to build? What are you going to do to ensure that we have healthy and sustainable communities? And what are you going to do to ensure that we invest in people, right? And that's where I look at skills training, I look at post-secondary education, I look at health data, right, as an example where we still need to get so much better. I needed an urgent CAT scan last summer, and it took 5 days longer than it needed to schedule it because they lost the fax, right? So,
Isn't that crazy?
It is
They're
crazy,
still using
right.
fax machines for doctors to put requisitions into hospitals to get MRI. Right. Like I'm waiting for one too. I've been waiting a year for an MRI. This is kind of weird.
So look, so a lot of these things, of course, they're going to be big price tags for some of them, but it's a matter once again of coming back to, are we spending smart or not, right? And a lot of the populist expenses, it's kind of like they're the junk food of public policy, right? They taste good momentarily, having this $200 check in our pockets. And yes, it sloshes around the economy and is maybe a little bit stimulative, but in the long term, it doesn't make us healthier. And I think we need to focus on the long term, what's going to make us healthier.
Don, do you have a sense about whether even just the threat of Donald Trump putting tariffs on Canadian goods is already disrupting the Ontario economy? And if so, how much?
Yeah, I'm very glad that you've raised that issue because that is one of my biggest concerns. I'll date myself, but I was there involved in the original promotion of the Free Trade Agreement and then the North American Free Trade Agreement. And the premise was pretty simple. If you want access to any of the three North American economies, you can locate within any one of those three North American economies. We never absolutely had that because we had some non-tariff barriers, but more or less we had that. If you needed access to the US market, you could feel comfortable locating in Canada. I think that premise has been shattered. Whether he puts them on or not, the threat that they could come back any single day. And so you're going to see it. And you saw there was a survey by KPMG that showed already up to 50% of the large firms in Canada are contemplating cutting investment here and increasing investment and even a physical presence in the United States. And I think that's logical on their part. So we have to counter that. We have to make ourselves even more attractive. We have to have a competitive system. We have to have competitive regulation. We have to make better use of our skilled labor force to draw companies here and keep them here. Because you're absolutely right. I think it's not just a question of whether we're going to get tariffs or not. The very threat is hurting and will continue to hurt Canada.
And that's exactly what we hear, right, from businesses, from both, we represent not just big business, not just small business, but all business, right? And so we're hearing that right across the board. And there's a lot of concern about that.
The uncertainty means people are just not prepared to make the investments that they otherwise would.
And to be clear, it's not just in Canada. We hear this. I've been talking to the CEOs of all 8 U.S. state chambers that border Ontario. We actually have 8 states that border Ontario by land or water, right? And they all are saying exactly the same thing, quietly.
So
right?
they're no happier about the Trump tariffs?
No, because it means devastation on both sides of the border. There are no winners in a trade war. There are only losers. And I want to pick up on what Don said about non-tariff barriers actually being something we need to worry about, right? There's all this discussion about the border. I think it's a little bit of a red herring because it gives the president the excuse to act without congressional approval on tariffs. But nonetheless, we have to take the border seriously and border security seriously. So what happens when there's new regulations and new constraints on how quickly things can move across the border, right? That becomes a non-tariff barrier, right? That becomes a scenario where it's more challenging for Ontario businesses to get the goods and services they need and for them to export goods and services to the US. So these are ways that we worry that if there's not very thoughtful consultation with the business community, with exporters, around how actually to make this work and how to make new border security rules work, that you're going to get a thicker border, even if there are no tariffs at all, right? So these are the sorts of things we need to talk about.
Kaylee, can I get you on this? We put that chart up at the beginning of our discussion showing that the debt to GDP ratio in the province of Ontario was a little over 37%. And there was some concern at this literal and figurative table expressed about how much wiggle room that allows the province of Ontario to spend in order to protect people for whatever's coming forward. 37 point something. The feds are at over 42%. Does that suggest that they have even less wiggle room to spend what it will take to protect people from what's coming?
I'm still on the page that we need to protect people from what's coming.
Regardless.
First, that is absolutely the number one issue that should be on the table, or response that should be on the table. No fussing about a number that's going to get bigger no matter what. And if we had had sort of conversations looking back and thinking about the lessons that we learned during the pandemic, we could have the I don't like to use the word targeted, but the more thoughtful kind of programs in place and the response that is needed. So we wouldn't be fussing about this number that in the face of a crisis, we can't be so worried about. We need to make sure that we're moving forward. And I'll just remind folks that, when we're going to be potentially losing demand from the United States, the more people who are laid off in Canada, the more demand we lose, even from inside our own country, because people don't have income. So we need to make sure that that's shored up so that we're delivering on all sorts of infrastructure projects that the government could be putting in the ground right now that are sort of in the planning phase. We need to make sure that stuff is buy Canadian. We need to make sure that the folks who are working in the retail sector are and in healthcare sector are earning the wage that they deserve. And if that is happening, then we're building the economy from the bottom up, and we're not only losing what's happening in the States, but gaining a little bit here.
I think the Buy Canadian movement is actually very interesting, right? And it's actually, I actually feel marginally more optimistic than a few weeks ago, if only because Trump has done something which no Canadian Prime Minister has been able to do in a long time, and
Unify
that's actually
the country.
unify us, right? This external threat.
Yeah.
And so you look at all the interest right now in buying Canadian, right? Okay, so can we make it easier for Canadian small businesses in particular to be part of government procurement practices,
Absolutely.
right? Procurement can be a very useful tool here. Can we get smarter at the way we procure goods and services?
But let me put the other side of the coin to Don. Do you worry if we do that America will do the same thing and they'll shut out our people from bidding on American government contracts?
No, absolutely. They already tried to do that. And it's not just Donald Trump. Of course, Biden initially and the Buy America was going to exclude Canada, and we got some concessions around there. But that threat has always been there. And it's a threat that seems to be spreading around the world. I mean, we open trade on a global basis, and for a while it's going to be somewhat narrower, but that just means that we have to get our competitiveness, productivity act together to compete in this new, more hostile world, but for our own sakes.
Dan, I got to ask you about this so-called Canada-U.S. Economic Summit that took place in Toronto last Friday. Prime Minister Trudeau showed up. He got caught on a hot mic saying that he is taking absolutely seriously this notion of Trump coming after us to become the 51st state. What was the big takeaway from that meeting for you?
I admit that when I showed up that morning, I didn't have very high expectations, right? I mean, I was worried that it would be a 3-hour-long photo op. But in the end, it actually proved to be very constructive discussion because we had labor there, we had business leaders there, we had nonprofit leaders, and so this wide range of stakeholders. We sat around round tables and we discussed things that need to be done. There were officials there from the federal government taking notes. Now, again, a lot of people will say, understandably, this is all talk, it's not action. But what was very interesting, I thought, was that there was a real unity of purpose, but also a similarity of the recommendations that were coming out of all of these discussion tables, right? And it was around the stuff we've already been talking about. We need to bring down interprovincial trade barriers. We need to make it easier to get big projects built in Canada and to get big things done. We've become a little complacent, we've become a little slow. It's easier to trade north-south than it is east-west, because of the interprovincial trade barriers, but also because we haven't been very good at moving our energy and our resources across the country, right? And so you heard these themes. You heard, I think, a real attachment to the idea of diversity in our country and how that's something we don't need to back away from that. We need to double down, right? Because that is an advantage. I was on the board of Queen's University during the last Trump administration, and we saw a big spike in global talent wanting to come to Canadian universities.
The Trump bump, they call it.
Yeah, the Trump bump. If we're not already seeing that, I'm sure we will. And that's an opportunity for us. But we have to have, obviously, the research opportunities, the research funding that's going to attract them. We have to be able to have a healthy system to enable them to be properly compensated and to be able to work here. But we've got advantages and opportunities. We just have to be smart enough to seize them.
Don, you've seen this kind of phenomenon come and go so many times over the years. I wonder whether you get cynical about the political levers this country has to pull when things like this happen, and whether our people are prepared to pull them. What do you think?
You know, it's funny, the title on the editorial in yesterday's Globe and Mail was that Canadians want their politicians to be bold. Ironically, that editorial wasn't particularly bold, but there are opportunities to be bold and to do things that are very controversial, and we have to do them. I mean, when you think about it, we've always had this productivity gap vis-a-vis the United States, but it's been growing. We're down now about 69%. Like, I get it. They got economies of scale. It's probably not realistic to be 100%. But when you think about it in the global context, when the Organization of Economic and Cooperation Development started in the 1960s, we had the fourth highest level of productivity. Now we're below the middle of the pack. So it's not just the United States. We've needed this wake-up call. We need a tax system that stops the disincentives to work, save, and invest. We need something that encourages small businesses across that 500,000 net income line and continue to grow. There's all kinds of things we've needed. We've got to get going and put them into place. And yeah, it's going to take boldness. I mean, here's one that everybody would hate. Let's cut our corporate and personal income taxes and pay for it by raising our GST rate. Absolutely, that makes sense from an economic. Everybody say that would be political suicide, but why? That would help out people. You can cover the regressive nature of it through the refundable tax credits. There's all kinds of things that we can do. It takes a bit of boldness, but we need to be bold at this point. We're in trouble.
Political boldness seems to be an oxymoron in some parts of this country, but you know, we're in the middle of an election campaign, so what do we say? We shall see. Let's see how it all unfolds. I want to thank the three of you for coming into TVO tonight and having this discussion. Don Drummond on the line from Scottsdale, Arizona. He from Queen's University, and of course from the eponymously named Drummond Report all those years ago. Kaylee Thiessen from Unifor. Daniel Tisch, Ontario Chamber of Commerce. Great to have you all here at TVO tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Matt.